Hey everyone, I'm Karl. I've been an animator now for about 6 years, 3 in film and TV and almost 3 in games. I started at Pickpock around the end of 2018, and since then I've mostly been working on our live titles Into the Dead 2 and Rival Stars Horse Racing. I work a bit with KEYFRAME, but mostly with MOCAP. I kind of wanted to do this talk because most of my game development knowledge has been learned on the job, and so I think sharing knowledge is really important. It's quite valuable, and I know I probably don't do things optimally or anything like that, but I wanted to share a bit about my process and a little bit about the way that I work. About what I do. Well, I'm an animator, so I animate. I work with MOCAP. I work in Maya and Unity. I set up state machines and prefabs, and I do a little bit of rigging and stuff like that. But whatever I do, it's pretty much all about using motion to express ideas. Sometimes that's about storytelling. Sometimes that's about bringing something to life or making a moment more celebratory or just trying to convey information about something. But whatever I'm animating, there's always a reason for it, and getting that meaning across, that's my job. I work closely with design to have a good understanding of what we're trying to achieve, and with tech to make sure that it's implemented properly. There are design pillars that we're working with and goals that we're working towards, so it's really a team effort to try and get there. Some considerations. The design pillars and all of these kind of considerations, they heavily influence the animation process. An action-oriented game that depends on responsive controls might be willing to sacrifice a little bit of realism or nice animation transitions for a snappy feel, whereas a game that's grounded in realistic horse motion, for example, might prioritize keeping as much of that motion intact as possible. There's usually a balance between gameplay and animation, and usually that balance is predicated on what's important for your game. For instance, on Into the Dead, the reload speed for a high-level gun is it's really fast, so fast that it looks kind of ridiculous. But it's more important that it feels responsive and fast for the player than that it looks realistic. You have to work closely with design and the rest of your team because communication around these kind of ideas is really important. If everyone's on the same page, then you should know what your game wants out of its animation. You don't always have to fight for the best, most realistic, intact motion all the time. Sometimes it's about getting something to work in like 10 frames and understanding when a longer animation might get in the way of the player's experience. What's most important is to know what your game's about and what your design pillars are and what value you can add as an animator. The way I communicate ideas is through animation, and on Rival Stars Horse Racing, that's mostly using motion capture. MOCAP is obviously a very efficient way to generate motion. It is limited by style, and it heavily caters to realism, but if that fits within the design of your game, then it's an incredibly powerful tool. This is a rough rundown of my workflow. On a MOCAP shot, I find the motion that I need, I cut it together, and try to get something in game as quickly as possible, because that'll inform a lot of decisions. If I know what it looks like in game, then I have a way better idea of camera and timing, blends, that kind of thing. But that's all context dependent. If I was doing an acting shot, I probably don't want to leave the eyes for last, for instance. And if I was adding another idle variation, and I already know what it looks like in game, then I might not export it till like it's almost done. And this is an example of how I might work in practice. We have some extensive idle animations in horse racing, especially here on the home screen. There's a bunch of different animations that play with the mare and her new foal. And we don't actually have foal mocap, so this is all made from adult horse motion and keyframe animation. This whole loop is a little bit big to play in one GIF, but this gives you the feel of it. And the idea behind it is that the foal just kind of eagerly follows its mother around as the mother walks in a circle. We don't have this motion. We don't even have the horse walking around in a circle like this. So this one is made up of a bunch of different walks and turns, animated in time with the foal moving in the middle, and keyframing the head to kind of track the mum a little bit. There's about 6 or 7 different mocap walks and turns that make up the mare's walk. Laying this kind of thing out can be a pain, but it's also very powerful. This is a 2-character idle. It's just under 30 seconds long. Normally, I'd expect to be able to put something together like this in a couple of days. Most of the animation work I do on horse racing is MOCAP, so it's all about manipulating motion data. This means anything from cutting it up, blending it together, making loops, repositioning it, changing poses and timing, and keyframing over the top. There are a lot of different ways to do this, through editing the keys directly, adding motion with animation layers or other tools. Like we have tools for mirroring animation or moving and rotating motion in world space. Having just some basic tools like these for editing motion can be really helpful. Even just like the basic stuff that comes with Maya is indispensable. Like animation layers. This is basically the clearest example I could think of to show what manipulating motion data looks like. On the left is a horse and rider canter loop, so that's horse motion. And on the right, it's been adjusted with a single animation layer. Basically, I'm just keying the controls into like a bear shape, and then animating the stride lengths and doing a little bit of cleanup. Honestly, animation layers are probably the most important tool I use. They can be used for creating loops, changing a character's direction, keyframing entire animations over ambient motion, fitting motion onto different rigs like here. They're really powerful, especially when dealing with MOCAP. I also use them to just try and retain as much motion data as possible. I'll layer on feet positions or head looks or poses, whatever, but animation layers allow me to maintain as much MOCAP data as I can, and it's that noise and ambient motion that can be lacking in keyframe animation that I'm just trying to keep in. Yeah, and this is it running around in our jumping prototype. So it took about half a day to get this in the game. It has a minimum number of animations to work with the controller. So it's basically just an idle, some turns, a few locomotion cycles, and a jump. And yeah, I exported that, and there you go. The TRAX editor. This is another Maya tool. It's pretty underutilized. I'd never used it before working at Pickpock, but it's pretty good for blending animations and creating loops. With an on-the-spot idle, for example, you can just make a clip, cut it in two halves, and then blend the loops together, or blend the ends together for an instant loop. It's also good at managing MOCAP clips and importing and exporting data. It's not perfect, though. Copying, blending, and generally dealing with motion between different rigs always has the potential for problems. Yeah, like here, sometimes it just doesn't work. Most of these are just from trying to copy over motion between different rigs. I don't know how they end up like this. Sometimes it just happens like this. I have a folder of dozens of these, so things go wrong pretty often. The middle one, for example, that's just a jump that looked perfectly fine in Maya, and then when I exported it, got it into our free roam tool, pressed jump, and it did that, so I don't know. Yeah. Keyframe, we do have a little bit of keyframe throughout the game. Like I said, we don't have full MOCAP, so we have to keyframe certain shots. I guess my best tip for keyframing, at least within a motion capture or like a realistic environment, is to find reference. Use it as much as you need. It's not cheating, I don't think, to stick as closely as you need to your reference, even if you're framing through. You can blend different bits of reference together as well, or supplement it with motion capture data to get what you need. But yeah, I reference heavily for these kind of shots. Even just as a guide, though, reference is really important if you're just looking to get your weight and timing, obviously. State machines. Thought I'd touch on state machines because they're one of the biggest difference between working in games compared to film. I've had to become quite familiar with how they work because obviously they drive most of the animation and blends within a game. I work closely with tech to make sure everything gets hooked up correctly, that it transitions nicely and triggers when I want it to trigger, and so that we're on the same page about how we're trying to achieve or what we're trying to achieve and how we're going about it. This is our free roam controller. or at least the main layer that I put together. It's more input driven than anything we have, anything else we have in Rival Stars, which can be a bit of a problem when what we're aiming for is realism. Our goal has been to keep as much natural motion as possible while making the player feel like they're in control of the horse. There are over 100 different animation clips within the controller. They range from locomotion cycles to victory celebrations to turns and ambient head shakes and tail flicks. Basically layering in as much as we possibly can to make it feel real. If a blend doesn't work, I'll add a transition animation. If an animation's repeated too much, then I'll add a variation. So long as text says we're under our optimization target, of course. Breaking it down so you can see what it's doing, it's a little bit simpler. The volume of animation is largely comes from variations rather than anything complex. At its core, it's a locomotion blend tree with a lot of locomotion cycles in it, and that's because it has multiple states for each locomotion type. So, for instance, there's a slow, a medium, and a fast canter, which means that a low-level horse with a low base speed will play a different canter cycle than a higher-level horse. This is to try and give us enough variation to make it feel real, like every horse is a little bit different, and to break away from identical looping cycles. So the same goes for most other things that play out of the locomotion tree, like the jumps, the pats and celebrations, which all have some number of variations. From there, we layered in a lot of stuff. There's an additive layer for controls that controls the lean of the horse, separate layers for head turns, and the slower locomotion cycles have bespoke turn animations within the blend tree because it's not enough just to lean them like when you're galloping. We layer on as much as we can because it's not just enough for the motion to look right, we want it to feel alive. A realistic action breaks down if it's the same canned motion over and over again to the point where it becomes noticeable. So we've layered in about a dozen different ambient head tosses and tail flicks that play randomly. We have 24 different jump variations spread over 5 different height categories and a dozen different locomotion cycles. And this kind of volume is one of the strengths of motion capture. We wouldn't have nearly as much here if it was keyframed. So hopefully it all comes together to make something that doesn't just have realistic motion, but that feels real too. But yeah, that's my rundown of some of the MOCAP in our game. And just some final thoughts about animating and working in games. I think one of the most important things I learned during my time at Pickpock, or that I've learned so far, is working in a team. Coming from film, I've mostly worked waterfall. You get a brief, you get boards, you get a time frame, and you just do the work. You might be in a team, but you're not really working as a team. Whereas making a game is much more fluid. Things change, things get updated. There's a lot more limitations to work within, but there's also like a bunch of different ways you can get things done. Teamwork is much more important. More often than not, it isn't just about telling someone else's story, it's about coming up with ways to communicate an idea. There's so much value in understanding your game and working with a team to come up with the best ways to solve a problem. If you know your game, its limits, its pillars, and what it's trying to achieve, then you'll have a much better understanding of what you can bring to the table in order to better serve those goals. And if you know your audience, then you know what they expect, and you know where you can kind of save time and where you can add value. So understand your game, understand your audience, and communicate. Thanks. Yay.